Well, Gillian, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's welcome again. Good to see you here. I'm joined here today with some very important voices where we can have a good discussion about the question of where cities are heading in an age of globalization, which is in some ways competing with the way in which our international system has been organized for the past 400 years. An international system based on the interaction of nation states. And increasingly we're seeing that globalization is posing real questions for not the viability of nation states, but how do nation states cooperate internationally? How do they deal with the challenges that we all face? And how do cities, perhaps as subnational entities, offer an opportunity to coordinate and to cooperate in dealing with these with these challenges and offer solutions. We have with us practitioners and thinkers, journalists and politicians to ask these kinds of questions. People who have served at high levels of government, people who have not served in these high levels. People have served nationally and internationally and at local levels. Let me start. We have John Tory, the mayor of Toronto since 2014. It's great to have you here with us today. Martin Wolf, who is the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times and has already been cited in the kickoff here. Eduardo Paes, who is the former mayor of Rio de Janeiro, including during the 2016 Summer Olympics, and the former chairman of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former administrator of the UN Development Programme, and Carl Bildt, former Foreign Minister and Prime Minister of Sweden. I want to turn to John Tory. Global cities in particular, and yours being one of them, proclaim that they are open to the world. It's, as Martin said, almost 40% of London's population is foreign-born. I believe in your city it's even larger than that.
51.
That's 51%. So they are open, but then they're also not particularly open in some ways. In some ways, they are leaving even people within their own cities behind. What are the tensions that are playing out in a global city like that?
Well, they're different kinds of, I wouldn't even describe them as, I guess they're tensions of a sort, but they're not the kind of tribal tensions necessarily, but I think the challenge that's in front of us is you don't want them to develop into that. I mean, Canada has been fortunate in that our sort of shared values that are pretty broadly shared across the country, including in the big cities, especially I think they're rooted in the big cities where we do have 51% of the population born outside the country, that we've somehow managed to have people feel accepted and embraced, and if there's a tension, it's not as between people of different nationalities or skin colors or sexual orientation or faith. But if there are challenges that are in front of us that could lead to tensions, and where there are some, I'm not trying to pretend we've achieved perfection by any means. I will say, by the way, that in the context of the periphery and the core, I am probably the single greatest unifying feature in Canada, in that I'm the mayor of Toronto, the largest and most disliked city in the country by everybody that's outside of it. So I consider that my contribution to national unity. But the tensions are about inclusion versus non-inclusion. And the fact is that if you look at the people who are not fully integrated and not fully included in the economy or the political or the social life of the city where I live, or of parts of the country, mostly urban, they tend to disproportionately be people who have come from somewhere else. And it's a practical problem to resolve. It's not because anybody's trying to exclude them, it's simply because we've been working hard at developing the language courses and the transition courses. I mean, the level of education of the people who are choosing to come to Canada is higher than the people who are already there. And yet, when they come to Toronto or to Canada and seek to get recognition for their educational or professional credentials they've had, it's very difficult. And some of that is, I'm sure, by design of professions that don't admit it, but put up certain barriers to entry. So we're developing transition courses. We're developing, kind of community hubs in the neighborhoods where these people live to avoid tension arising from a lack of inclusion. We're working hard at things as simple as language courses. I mean, how can anybody become fully included if they can't speak one of our two official languages at all? So we're working at that, but it is, if you said to me, well, where is the strain and where is the challenge for us? That's where it is, as opposed to the kind of tribal, more tribal roots of some tensions that exist elsewhere in the world. We just went through now again, we don't have refugees, coming on foot sort of across the border or in boats, but we took a very open approach. And when it was put forward by leaders, including myself, that we should be open based on all of our past experiences with refugees, this was not a subject of any particular debate in the country. Now, I will say we didn't have the same pressures that countries, say, in Europe would have, but it's just symptomatic of the attitude and the values, but we still have a challenge with inclusion.
I want to go from the nation to a more international perspective of how cities can cope with these issues. And John Tory, increasingly cities are looking not just to their national governments or even to their peripheries, they're looking to counterparts in other parts of the world to address the problems that they face in order to find solutions. You're active in something that you've called urban diplomacy as an initiative. Describe what it is that you're trying to do specifically with those issues and the impact you're seeing as it relates to the overcoming some of the divisions and tensions that you find in your own city and society.
Happy to address that. I just want to go back to the previous question for 1 second to say that one thing we did in very practical political terms just in the most recent Canadian election was that the big cities had a caucus of the biggest cities, which represented a huge proportion of the members of parliament, and we put all of the parties, put their feet to the fire, and we maintained unity between and among ourselves about getting them back into housing and transit in a meaningful way, and it was very successful because they couldn't avoid us. We were together, we represented together 80% of the population of the country, and so it wasn't so much about trying to convince anybody in the outlying areas of the cities of the merits of our case. It was a matter of convincing the politicians who we were electing, and it worked very well. It was a straightforward, practical, political, and because we stayed united on it, it worked very well. Now, on the question you asked, we have the good fortune in Canada, again, where a lot of what we would do, even through the urban diplomacy, is, I think cities should be, in an ideal world, supporting the national ambitions of their country. There should be a consistency between the two, and I think on things like, open trade, climate change, open immigration, and so on, we actually have the good fortune that most of the cities in the country, in fact, I might even say all of them, have views and values and aspirations that are consistent with the national aspirations in that regard. But I think that the urban diplomacy today, to me, has a lot more to do with the practical delivery of services and the solution of some of the problems that I talked about and we've all talked about, whether it is housing and transit, whether it's integration of people, who integrates refugees? I mean, national governments may set policies about how many are being taken and that sort of thing. Who integrates them? Cities do. Who builds public transportation? Who actually fixes the environment? In large measure in terms of the practical day-to-day energy retrofitting of buildings, building of public transportation to get cars off the roads. Do people invest in cities or do they invest in countries? I mean, I think that there's no hard and fast rule to that, but by and large today, they're investing in city regions, not in countries. And so, to me, the advantage of this urban diplomacy is simply that I don't mean this to be disrespectful of our national government or anybody else's or our provincial governments. They are ripping us off when it comes to the fact that we have those responsibilities and we don't have the ability, we are subservient and don't have the ability even to raise the money necessary to do the things we're responsible for doing. But I'm going to learn more from a meeting with Rahm Emanuel today in Chicago or from sitting with the Mayor of Jerusalem as I did on Monday night in Toronto about all of those things I just mentioned, to be quite frank, that I'm going to learn from meeting with most people in the national government or in other national governments, because they're not actually delivering these services on a day-to-day basis. We are. And so you can learn from talking to anybody, but I find that the urban diplomacy allows us the opportunity, as we had this morning, as we're having tonight, to sit in a room with people who have like responsibilities and compare how you're doing it, because that's where the rubber hits the road on almost every one of these issues. Not interest rates and not foreign policy, but on everything else that matters to people and our ability to include and integrate them and make them whole in the context of our country or any other. It's in cities.
Let me go to some of the questions that have been asked, and one of it is on the role of the private sector, which we've really focused on sort of the public sector here, but the role of the private sector, which in some ways is also not bound by national boundaries. How can the private sector be a force to help address part of these problems. I mean, we'll have to rely on the private sector being a key part of the economic driving force. But the question is, what's the role of the private sector in making the case for cities becoming more powerful, as well as to stimulate inclusive growth?
And not just the digital age, because all of that innovation is pretty much coming out of the private sector, and I guess the research sector to some extent as well. But same with climate change. I mean, where are the development of the new methodologies, the better methodologies with respect to energy retrofitting or renewable generation? It's going to come from private ingenuity, private capital, and so I think what we have to get over is the fear and anxiety about the private sector. There's a certain fear and anxiety that sets in I'll call it small p political terms, that everybody's going to get ripped off and so on and so on. And I think we have to just remember, governments the one thing they do is they don't have a lot of ingenuity in them when it comes to those kinds of developments of new products and things like that, but they do have the upper hand usually in terms of being able to regulate those things to the extent that's necessary. And so if we can remember that the governments have the upper hand, but then harness the ingenuity of the private sector, I don't think it's an option. When you sort of presented it and said, well, is there a role or should there be a role? We can't possibly cope with the transition to the digital age and to solving problems like climate change without huge leadership, ingenuity, and capital and discipline from the private sector, but properly overseen by those who are put in a position to do so, which is people like us have been and others.
Martin?
That's a big focus on, without getting to the tax issue, on big business though, but I actually watch in our own city and elsewhere, what's really happening now that I think represents much more of the solution to a lot of the problems that we're talking about in cities is coming from two-person businesses that are starting up and four-person businesses. And I agree, I mean, global capitalism is big businesses that are global by definition, but there's so much more of these small local businesses now where people have sort of figured out it's better to create a job for yourself than it is to know how to get one. Right. And they're just going and doing it. And I think that's part of that transition that was referred to earlier on to the digital age.
It's true. But some of them become global overnight.
They do.
Even small businesses can be global. That's part of that is a genuine part of the digital revolution.
You give us two examples here.
It does raise, and there's a final question which I want to pick up from the audience here. It raises the question of leadership. And ultimately, and we have two national leaders and two local leaders. John, final word.
I'll just associate myself with, in particular, the comments of Helen and also Martin. I think cities in many cases now have the quality of leadership that's necessary to get the job done. And more importantly, in a way that they by definition remain closer to the people. The people look first. I'm amazed in the job that I now have, and I went straight into that job without having been in the city council and so on, but that they look first to the city to solve any problem. They're oblivious to and frankly frustrated by you telling them that some other level of government has responsibility for that. And so I think you have to stay close but look afar, back to our urban diplomacy point, because you have to figure out what is the best way to solve climate change, what is the best way to integrate refugees, what is the best way to build transit. And that's where I think the urban diplomacy comes in. A lot of that's not going to come from the other governments in your own country. And then I just think this massive fiscal imbalance has to be addressed. In our case, in our country, 8 cents on the dollar is actually collected by and the responsibility of cities when we have all of these responsibilities to do all these things and we have to rely on, I described myself as like a little boy in short pants having to go to the other governments and beg them for money to do things they and the people expect us to do. And that has to be addressed, and I don't know how that's going to be addressed. It's not a matter of who's in the office, it's a matter of these structures that probably aren't going to be changed anytime soon.
John, Martin, Eduardo, Helen, Carl, thanks so much for getting us started today. Terrific conversation.